So, all right, great. Thank you, Amanda. All right, well, welcome everybody, and thanks so much for taking the time to join us today for our second in our Climate Smart Forestry series. My name is Kate Four. I'm Executive Director of Vermont Woodlands Association. I'm actually stepping in today to help facilitate this webinar. Amanda Palumbo, who is our AmeriCorps member and has been really the force behind coordinating these webinar series, is under the weather today. So I'm stepping in to help facilitate the conversation. I'm really excited to be here and excited for the presentation with Steve Bick. For those of you who are not familiar with Vermont Woodlands Association, just a quick kind of explanation of who we are and what we do. We are the state's largest and oldest forestry nonprofit. In fact, actually, our organization was started back in 1915. We are a community of woodland owners and woodland managers. And really, our work centers around providing year-round, education and advocacy for the stewardship, use, and enjoyment of our private forests. And so a lot of our work is doing programs just like this, offering webinars and workshops and woods walks throughout the year, really as an opportunity to get folks out in the woods and come together to talk about various forestry issues. If you're interested in learning more about our organization, you can certainly check us out online at www.vermontwoodlands.org. But you found us here on this webinar today. So thanks again for joining us, and happy to share more about our organization if you're interested. Okay, before we get started with the presentations, I think we're all pretty familiar with the way of the world of Zoom these days, but just a reminder that the webinar today is being recorded. So you're welcome to turn your camera on and unmute yourself at any point during the presentation, but just remember that the webinar is being recorded, and we do that so that folks who aren't able to join us live today can still benefit from the content. We will turn your mic or mute your mic in order to help improve the quality of the recording. But as the presentation gets underway and as we open it up for questions, we'd love to hear from you. So please feel free during the question and answer period to unmute yourself and ask a question live. And then I guess the other kind of logistical thing I just wanted to share is that just a reminder that today's webinar is approved for SAF continuing education credits for Vermont licensed foresters. So there will be a Google survey at the end of the webinar today. And to get those credits, please go ahead and fill that Google survey out, and we will send you a certificate of attendance for those credits. Okay, and so with that, again, today is our second in our Climate Smart Forestry series, and we'll be discussing the implications and challenges really facing all of us in the forestry world regarding climate change and some of the weather patterns that we've seen this year. So, Steve, you can introduce this and explain this much better than I can. So I'll go ahead and turn the reins over to you. We also are joined by Dave Wilcox, who is watershed forester with Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. You guys are really the team behind this webinar today. So I'll go ahead and just turn the reins over to you to have you guys introduce the presentation and yourselves.
Thanks, Kate. I think I'll just do a quick introduction of myself, and before I get very far into presenting, I know Dave had a couple of things that he wants to share. So by way of background, first and foremost, I'm a forester, a Vermont licensed forester, in fact. But in terms of my work, you could think of me as, I guess, sort of like an extension professor who doesn't have the burden of a university. So I work mostly on forest economy related projects with public agencies and organizations, and with a lot of private enterprise in the forest products industry. So keeping with that, for several years now, I've been looking at climate adaptations in the forest product supply chain, and I have some things to share with you that are part of two projects. But before I do that, Dave and I had a game plan yesterday, and he was going to introduce some things I think that FPR has going on in terms of climate change.
Yeah, Kate, I'm going to share my screen. I'm not sure that I can.
Should I stop sharing mine?
You should be able to now, Dave.
Okay. So, can folks see my screen? Okay, so I'm my name is Dave Wilcox. I'm the watershed forester with the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. Um, and I work every day on various water quality practice or projects. Anywhere, anything from bridge rentals to AMP compliance, regulatory sort of things, um, working with our other departments in ANR to help get the word out about water quality and managing forests with while protecting water quality. So, what I wanted to do is just kind of make folks aware of our website. What's one of the ways that we get information out to folks. And I wanted to, the website. If you go to the FPR website, you can find it in the forest tab under um, for foresters and loggers, and acceptable management practices. And we have a lot of things on the website for as far as information and outreach. We have a video that really talks high level about the TMDL and water quality and phosphorus in Lake Champlain and what we're doing to try to mitigate that. We have a webinar that goes over all of the, we call it Water in the Woods, summary of Vermont's AMPs, and anybody can watch that at any time. You can click on the AMP manual, and also you can find it on it. We have an app for the AMP manual now, so you can get it on your smartphone. Has several different features. One feature is a clinometer that helps you get the slope of a trail or a road so you can properly implement the spacing of the water bars. Um, and then we have various other links to types of assistance that are out there. We have we have foresters in all the districts that are able to come out and do technical assistance. If you have a bridge or a trail, certain trail that is tricky, and you're concerned about, whether how you should use it, whether you should use it. Those folks can come out and give you technical assistance. We have the contacts for the county foresters, um, and then we have a tab that's not quite fleshed out entirely yet. Current funding opportunities where the DEC is working on, and we do have through NRCS various funding sources for clean water practices through the regular NRCS program, as well as the RCPP Regional Conservation Partnership Program for water quality practices as well. And then additionally, we have information on temporary bridge rentals. The department owns bridges, 5 steel bridges that we rent, and there's also wooden bridges available through the natural resource conservation districts. So it's kind of a one-stop shop here for all sorts of different education outreach and tools to work on, forest harvesting practices. And as we know, and what we're going to learn about from Steve, is we're seeing a lot of changes with climate change and a lot of challenges, and every little bit helps. Planning is key. That's one of the messages that I try to tell folks is, proper planning can really make a big difference and help you be prepared for what the weather brings us. And if you're not ready to strike when the iron is hot, you may miss some opportunities. So, and I would just want everybody to know, if you email me, if you have questions about how to access any of this information, or if something isn't working, or you want a copy of the AMP manual, send me an email, give me a call, shoot me a text. Plenty of ways to get in touch with me. And also, I'll just put a plug in for this Saturday. We're going to have the second part of this webinar series, or this webinar, which is a field visit to an operation of timber sale in Berlin, where they're currently harvesting timber, and we're going to do a tour there. The consulting forester, Mike Brown, is going to be there. We're gonna see hopefully see some equipment, and whether they're working or not depends a little bit on the weather. But that's the plan. So I will be there. I will bring plenty of AMP manuals, and look forward to meeting folks and talking, answering questions, right on the site, on the ground, with things happening. So that's all I have. Happy to answer questions later on, if you have any. But I want to give Steve plenty of time to get started.
All
So
right.
take it away, Steve.
I'm going to try and get my screen back up there.
All right. How do I do?
I think I do it on my
Okay.
end.
Good.
All right. You have my screen now?
Yes.
Great. Let me just get my preview screen in front of me. So climate adaptation in the forest product supply chain, as I mentioned earlier, I have been working on this issue for a while, and I had a cooperative agreement with the Forest Service that I'll tell you about, and then some current activity with FPR as well. So some of you might remember it was just about 3 years ago to this day that I presented a very similar webinar, part of the FBR's climate series with Ali Kasiba. And so a lot of what I have to share, at least some of it, is going to be a repeat of that. But I think it's important because it leads into what I have going on now with this LSR project with FPR. So that original project was with, well, I've had a good work relationship with state and private forestry at the Forest Service for some time, and they'd approached me, oh gosh, going back to 2017 to do this sort of qualitative look at climate adaptation across the Northeast region. But some good things came of that, not the least of which was that they said, "Hey, we want you to look at the whole region, but really we want you to look at Vermont." And in particular, we want you to work with Paul Frederick. Forest Service always thought the world of Paul and wanted to involve him with things. And it gave me the opportunity to get to know Dave and some of the other people at FPR as well. So working under that cooperative agreement, I got a lot of the information I want to share here. And one of the things that came to that after a few attempts was the opportunity to submit an LSR application with Forest Parks and Rec. And kind of as a result of that, I had a project. Ali had a project. Commissioner Danny said, "Hey, why not put these two together because they are kind of complementary." So we did that, and then because I'm in the private sector, it's always a little bit tricky. How do you actually contract? So we involved the Northeastern Loggers Association. That's a group it's been an important work partner. They've been an important work partner for me for years. So that's who we're running the LSR through. So in terms of what I have to share today, I want to talk specifically about changes in our working climate. What does this mean? What's changed about our seasonal weather patterns? I'll share just a thumbnail of the 2018 adaptation findings and the things specific to the forest products supply chain. And while I'm at it, why don't I take a minute here to tell you what I mean by this supply chain, because particularly in Vermont, this seems to mean different things to different people. I'm talking about the stump through the primary mills. So forest landowners, the foresters they work with, logging, trucking, and then the primary mills where they take those initial primary wood products. So then the LSR adaptation project, we're in year one of that. I'll tell you more about that. Climate adaptation needs survey. So that's in circulation. I suspect some of you have already responded to that. I'll tell you more about that and even share some of the preliminary results. And I'm going to want to do all that and still leave time for questions. So I better get rolling here. So significant changes we've seen in seasonal temperatures, certainly, and in monthly precipitation. I'm going to go into a little more detail about those. And if you think about the cumulative impact of that, well, it changes soil moisture patterns. And if I had to confine, the impacts of climate change on the forest products industry to 2 words, I'd say soil moisture patterns, 3 words. Mud seasons, we have several, at least two. Storm events, more significant storm events maybe than in the past. Pest diseases, invasive species, and policies. I'm not going to talk about those. Were part of that initial study. I'm not going to touch too much on that. One of the things I did when I started looking at this was realize I didn't know enough about climate change to carry on these conversations. You know, you would hear things like, you know, do you know the average temperature is 2 degrees warmer than in 1900? And really, I wasn't around then. I've been around a long time, but that didn't tell me anything. And one of the suggestions from the Northeast Climate Hub was to take a close look at the NOAA data. So at the county level for New York and New England, I looked at monthly precipitation and temperature data for a period of the 1980s through the 2010s. So I was wrapping this up, you know, just as all the 2019 data was in, and also did a lot of one-on-one interviews with people. Kind of well, in the forest products industry, you might think you're going to do a structured interview, and it goes whatever direction it goes in, and then some focus groups, and got some information. And the other thing that I did at that time was, or I did with several people, was put some of this NOAA climate information out there in a Northern Logger magazine article to kind of prime the pump. So when I came to people, maybe they had seen this article. So actually, several of us cooperated on this. Allison Berry was the lead author. If her name is familiar to you, you might get her great weekly climate newsletter, The Pulse. So she helped with this. And then let me just show you quickly the monthly comparisons that we found. So why did I pick the 1980s as the starting point? Well, that's when I entered the forest products industry, so it was particularly relevant to me. So when we looked at this in terms of comparisons, a few patterns really jumped out that I think are important in the forest product supply chain. In terms of temperature, the month of January is 3.6 degrees warmer, or was in the 2010s, compared to the 1980s. All right. The other month that was really warmer was September, which, you know, is sort of significant. And I'll explain why in a minute. And then December, 4.6 degrees warmer. Two of the most important winter months are a whole lot warmer than they have been in the past. Then we looked at precipitation. The differences, you know, this doesn't really capture the differences in intensity of weather events, but it does capture overall precipitation. If you look at June, it's 1 degree warm, or it's I'm sorry, we're talking about precipitation, a full inch more rain than we've gotten in the past. And then if we look at October, 1.5 more inches, and December, 1.3 more inches of precipitation. So if you think about these in combination, we've got a wetter period in June than we've had in the past. Often we've seen things sort of dry out, forest operations get rolling again, and then they are halted by that rain and some rain events into the summer. And then we think about September. Often that's our driest month. It finally dries out. But what happens right after that? We get into October. Maybe it's warmer, but so what? You know, there's more precipitation at a time when the leaves are falling, the days are shorter, and things can go from really great to work in the woods to really wet and a real challenge, and we enter a mud season. And then when you get into December, where it's warmer and wetter, we get a prolonged fall mud season. So these are the comparisons between for this is for New York, and then actually for all the northern forest states. So the logging chance is changing. That was one of the really pithy quotes that came out of some of the focus interviews that I did at that time. Southern New England, and I've lumped that with Pennsylvania just because they had similar patterns and similar things were going on there. You know, the numbers are different. The story is the same. The only real difference is they were used to it already, that start-stop pattern that we had for forest operations. Well, the first step towards change is awareness, and the second step is acceptance, according to Nathaniel Brandon, and he's right about that. You know, when it was suggested that it might be difficult to talk to the forestry community about climate change, It turns out that they were way ahead of us or way ahead of the people that thought that, because they were living it. There wasn't a debate about whether it was going on or not. It was more like, here's what we're experiencing. I've got a couple other graphics on this point to share. So in terms of lesser winners, I tried to pick an indicator that I thought would be important. And that, I looked at January average temperature. In particular, I looked at counties that had an average temperature of 20 degrees or less. So in my mind, that's means you're getting that solid freezing weather you need. So the difference between the 80s and the 2010s is across the Northeast, we have 30 fewer counties with those cold winter, with that cold weather that's needed for freezing conditions. And then if we look at December, which was always, a time we may or may not have gotten good solid winter weather, it's even more pronounced. But in some places, winter really isn't starting in December yet. All right, adaptations. So I want to talk about the adaptations, and I'll restrict it really to forest management and harvest scheduling, logging practices, a little bit about logging equipment, roads and infrastructure, and also procurement. So I'm trying to cover all the bases in the supply chain. So in terms of managing forests, harvest scheduling is more challenging than ever. You might plan for what you thought was the right time of year to do things, and then the weather doesn't behave the way it used to. So we're often looking at second best in terms of times when we want to go places. As one big land manager told me, we've gotten better at picking when we go, where we go, and when. This group, managing a lot of TIMO lands, they've actually altered their inventory processes so that they give each stand a rating at the time of inventory for the times of year when it's possible to harvest. That's not even talking about silviculturally when you might want to be there, but physically when you can get there in terms of access and soil moisture conditions. That photo is maybe about a half mile from where I'm sitting. I was very proud of the way that shelter wood looked in late September, so much so that I thought, why don't we just continue this harvest? There's more we could get done. So we inched into 10 days of October, during which all the leaves fell off and it started to rain. And I have been regretting that ever since. In terms of infrastructure, we're seeing more often that improvements, including gravel roads, you just need gravel to have the access you need. So it's one thing to say we're doing more of that, but what does that really mean? It costs more to harvest, costs more to access timber, and who's bearing those costs? We're seeing upgraded winter road systems. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And again, I threw a quote in here. We're using bigger culverts because we get more flash events. Probably the biggest mistake that we could all point to that people did in the past was not have big enough culverts. But even when they did have culverts that were appropriately sized for the time, we're not in those times anymore. And that's a common thing to have happen. Culverts will fail because they're not big enough. So I mentioned about improved winter roads. I like to show this photo of my friend Bruce Koenig. I've been fortunate enough to know this guy since 1973. What he doesn't know about working in the woods probably isn't worth knowing, but he's 81 now. Here's a guy that really knows how to freeze winter roads in place. So a lot of the Northeast region, we've relied on winter roads, and not knowing all who's here, maybe I should elaborate. Think of that as a typical road without gravel. So a lot of places they're going to be accessed. This picture was taken in a remote spot in the Raymond Hills where Bruce and I had a harvest in 1993. We were back there together in 2019. So that much time passes, and there's no reason to build a gravel road there. What we saw region wide, or what I heard from people, was that we're losing the type of people, who know how to freeze a winter road. That's a real art. And one of the responses, and Dave, you and I talked about this, I don't know how much it's happening in Vermont, maybe a little bit in the Kingdom, but in some of the other places on the larger holdings, they're making what they call improved winter roads. So they're getting all their drainage in place, everything but gravel, so that when the time comes, they can freeze the road more quickly. When they get the weather, they can get right on it and freeze it in place. The other thing that happened during this time period that I'm kind of covering in terms of looking at climate data is that water quality AMPs kind of came into their own. We started to see widespread compliance efforts by 2000 region wide. Vermont was really the leader in this. It used to be something we thought of as cleanup, and now clearly it's something you've got to follow the whole time you're on the site if you want to be able to work. I think the timing of this has been such that the AMPs, and it's funny that Vermont's the leaders and they're just called acceptable practices where they're called best practices in other places. So they came along at a time when we needed them most. When we were starting to experience these change in soil moisture patterns, and you really had to implement these things, not just to protect water quality, but just to be able to operate. I never fail to take the opportunity to point this thing out, that when we look at BMP or AMP considerations, there are the structural things, and they're important. The costs of these are relatively easy to quantify, but then there are behavioral BMPs, right? The things that cost a whole lot, no one wants to really quantify, except the people who are living them. And what I mean by this is suspending operations when ground conditions don't allow you to harvest. And that comes with a really high opportunity cost if you're the logger in that situation, right? If you've got to do the right thing and stop operating, the opportunity cost is huge. Dave already mentioned the AMP app. I wanted to throw this in here quick. The Northern Logger app integrates in one section some of the Vermont AMP specs. This is in no way a substitute for the app that Dave told you about, but it's a handy app anyway, and it's one of my products. So it's also free. So northernloggerapps.com. Let's talk more specifically about logging and some of the changes that have taken place in part as adaptations to climate change. This is not a particularly pretty site. Don't worry, Dave. This is not in Vermont. I don't think it's an actual violation. It's just not that pretty.
Just ugly.
Yeah. So in terms of logging, we're seeing some changes, and we saw some changes in equipment over time that, at least in part, could be attributed to climate, but also other forces. Whole tree harvesting is probably region-wide the dominant system, in terms of harvested volume. And, one of the people I interviewed, a logger in Western Maine, said he went to these 6-wheeled skidders. He said it was the best business move he ever made because it meant he could get by with less labor and less fuel, and by less fuel. So in the 1990s, and this guy, the reason he's been in business a long time is he collects and keeps good data and makes use of it. He was moving 0.43 tons per gallon. In the 2010s, he was moving 1.1 ton per gallon. And by the way, there's a huge difference between the 90s and the 2010s in fuel prices, right? So talking to, I was around then, but loggers didn't talk about fuel in the 90s as one of their major cost stressors at the time. And I never tire of telling about the time I filled my car with gas at the Pilot in Blacksburg for 77 cents a gallon, 1994. I know my kids are tired of hearing about it, but hey, fuel prices are a big part of the finances of logging at this point. All right, cut to length logging. This is when, in this era, it's really emerged. It's in part, I think, influenced by climate adaptation. There are situations in which you gain some operating time in the year by forwarding as opposed to skidding. And let's face it, the big impact on water quality we need to worry about, for the most part, is taking place during the skidding operation. I think there's a myth among some people a few steps removed from harvest operations that forwarders don't make ruts, and that's simply not true. But there are times of the year where you might gain some operating time, and we are seeing that's really important. The other adaptation I saw in logging, and in part it goes back to that those maps I showed earlier, is that you could be a logger and travel a little farther and travel maybe an hour south, and you're out of winter, or you're in a place that's already dried up already. So we're seeing particularly heavily capitally intensive operations needing to do their procurement of wood to cut across a wider area. We're seeing winters that look like winter but are not. So underneath that somewhere is the rest of a very large skidder. And for all intents and purposes, that probably looked like winter when he didn't knowingly drive it into that spot. That's actually on Tug Hill in New York. And if you've heard of Tug Hill, it's mostly famous for a long, long winter, but it sure wasn't winter on the day when that got parked there. So this was a quote someone passed along to me. Actually, I think it was an FPR forester, but he said the logger he had on a state job said, "I'd rather buy 10 loads of stone than be out of work for a week." So there's that recognition that there may be more planning and more expense involved and more improvements to make sure you can work. Excavation equipment has become a must in logging. This was, I saw the writing on the wall. That was a pretty prominent cut to length logger down the Meadowee Valley that told me that. And I think he got a working lands grant to help him with an excavator. Let me move on to wood procurement. So in this area, people have had to do things differently because there's a narrower window to supply themselves. So if you don't get any logs, it doesn't matter how many orders you have. If you've got a sharp eye and can recognize what species that is there in that pile, you might guess that Colleen Goodrich was the person that told me that. So that's white cedar, a species that primarily you typically would get access to in the winter, right? But she's got to run the mill year round. And I know in talking with her, one of the adaptations was that, no supplier is too small. No one's insignificant to her and to their mills. So if people bring wood in, they'll take it when they can get it, because you never know when they might have more. Another thing I heard was that some of the mills were providing AMP or BMP assistance in terms of as a procurement strategy. Of course they would do that on standing timber they bought, but there are other suppliers they might loan a bridge to. A few will reluctantly help with permit applications and that sort of thing. But one of the big mills told me they had 30 bridges that they loaned out, and they planned on adding more. All right, and then a whole suite of things is what I heard when I talked to some of the bigger mills here. So this is Finch paper. So as many of the people know here, much of the standing timber in Vermont is low-grade wood. A lot of our forest management efforts are kind of built around how do we handle this low-grade wood? Well, there are no integrated pulp and paper mills in Vermont. So pulpwood is going to go to New York or to Maine, or it's going to be used for firewood and other things like that. So, they're doing things like extending their supply area at certain times of the year, having a remote chip yard in another region to bring chips in, other concentration yards, sort of looking at better backhaul strategies. And the interesting thing they were doing as well was financing some young loggers at one of these mills, because they saw that as, we're going to need replacement capacity as we go further along in this. I did want to bring one policy that came up. I'm going to stay off of policy at the larger level, but at the local level, road posting is a big deal. And it's changed over time. Part of it's culture. Well, part of it's clearly necessitated by the changes in the weather patterns. If you'd seen my road in North Facein last week, and I haven't been there this week, but I imagine it's about the same. It looked like they used to look late in March. So road supervisors have gotten less tolerant of trucking during any time of the year, more so than winter. Some people like to tell me they have no discretion. I don't know about that. The local level, it used to be someone in those jobs who was maybe one step removed from logging or a little closer connection. So there, at least a little bit of that is a cultural shift. Some it's just the realities. The roads go bad. I was talking with some people about logging in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan 10 days ago. And at that time, every road in that part of the state was posted, and that the entire Upper Peninsula, which is generally thought of as a winter wonderland up there. So it's not just us. Okay, if you leave things to chance, you're going to fail. That was one resounding quote that came out of some of the interviews I did at that time. You know, Dave, you touched on that, I think, earlier when you talked about planning and being ready for things. It's an important part. It's there's a whole lot more to this than showing up in terms of getting your timber harvested, being a logger, or being a mill trying to procure wood. And I guess one last thing about this, there were some deliverables that came out of that project that are floating around. So I post most of my material on my site, loggingchance.com. So there was a summary report, a toolkit, and then seasonal climate change in Vermont. There's county level data that might be a useful reference. All right, on to this discussion of this landscape scale restoration project that is kind of one half of a larger project. Ali Kasiba is doing the other half, and I think she did one of your seminars already. So I've got a 3-year timeline, and in the first year I'm doing a needs assessment of, what can we do to support climate adaptation in the forest product supply chain. And this project is specific to Vermont. And so I'm partway into year 1. Year 2, I'm supposed to create and compile resources for assistance. In the 3rd year, I'm supposed to do outreach and do some service provider trainings, figure out what things we can do to help people, and work to get those things in their hands. So I want to talk about this needs assessment. So who recognizes this image? This is Philip Goodwin's Riding the Logs. Dave, did you get this postcard in the mail?
Yes.
Good. And you filled out the survey almost instantly, I'm sure.
Well, I actually did it before I got it.
Good. I wish I could say that about everyone. So I sent 648 of these out. Only 2 were returned for insufficient address, so I'm proud of that part. But I could use some more responses. So my reasoning behind using that Goodwin print was I wanted to send out something people would be reluctant to throw away. Earlier this week, a logger told me, I keep looking at that and meaning to fill it out. So at least I know he didn't throw it away. So if, I gather we probably have a collection of, Kate, who's probably here, forest landowners and some foresters. If you're a forest landowner and have done some recent harvesting or are trying to get some plan, please take a few minutes to fill this out. I'm eager to have, I've got some partial responses to share, but I'm going to keep this up for a little while still. I do have some preliminary results from this because it's been out for a month or so, and I'll share them now. I'm going to cherry pick a few things, but a lot of open-ended questions were asked because it should appeal to foresters, landowners, loggers, and mills alike. They were sort of worded like, how is your ability to sell, harvest, or procure timber or forest products been impacted? And so, what seasons challenge your ability to do these things was a question I asked. No, not surprising that 87% said the spring was a challenging time of year to do those things, but fully 2/3 of respondents labeled the other seasons as a challenge. Well, it's always a challenge, and more so in the spring. So that was, if I would have had to guess 15 years ago, I would have expected it to be, maybe 20% in those other seasons. And I asked for explanations and I got some. So lack of reliable deep cold and sufficient snow cover in the winter, long periods of excessively wet conditions in spring and summer, especially as well as mid to late fall. So he didn't leave any seasons out there in that response. Extremely wet conditions in the summer and the winter. Someone else said the roads are soft. It doesn't matter if you can do a great job in the woods with the right equipment and the right AMP practices if the road is posted. Weather, seasonal market demand. Certainly markets are also a limiting factor. No surprise here that 85% of respondents reported needing an excavator on harvesting jobs, and 54% said a bulldozer. I think an excavator might be preferred from an AMP standpoint. However, you can also skid wood with a dozer. The other question I asked was, how many mud seasons do you have? Thinking, the last time around in 2018, when I was talking to people, some weren't even identifying fall as a mud season yet. They just talked about spring. And I gave them a lot of choices. And it turns out early winter is the new mud season. Sure was this year. I think it was last year as well. And it sort of implies we got a little bit of a freeze up, as we often do in December. And then things got idled. A lot of places, it didn't look like winter until not that long ago. What did you tell me, Dave? It didn't look like you were in the kingdom yesterday, and it didn't look like it often has.
No, it was maybe 10 inches of snow in Maidstone.
Yeah,
Should
that's
be
not much of a
10
base
feet.
for this. Yeah. I asked, again, I got some good comments. This was really a great explanation, and I'll probably use this quote again. "I cannot generate enough revenue to cover my overhead, and it's affected my ability to keep employees. It costs more when we work in these conditions because of the added expense of maintaining trails, roads, and landings." So that's a logger response, but if we think about maybe three links in this chain, or four if you count the truckers, that's the weak link. Nothing happens. No timber gets harvested without them. No mills get supplied without them. And that's really where I think we had to have a lot of our concern. Logging has become far more capital intensive, and you cannot invest a lot of capital and idle it. Lack of income during this time. The selling season is very short. I asked, what are the critical factors in your ability to harvest or procure wood products? And the most common responses were lack of freezing in traditional winter months, more frequent rain events, prolonged mud season. So no real surprises. When I asked about adaptive practices, this kind of really, Dave, this goes in line with what you were saying, this emphasis on planning and project management. 64% said that, and this is across the supply chain. I'm glad to see that. If any of you are going to be at the New England SAF meeting next month, I'm going to go on and on about this topic in talking about critical chains in the forest product supply chain, both in terms of project management and other things. Increased use of stone, 57% of respondents identified that. Weather conscious trucking decisions and scheduling, adaptive logging practices on the ground. Innovation and AMP practices. I think of AMPs as something, Dave, I think of these as things that continue to happen, right? We're going to continue to see innovation because new challenges keep coming up.
Absolutely.
And then sort of a laundry list of other things here. This really got my attention. I asked this question on two topics. How many weeks was your ability to sell, harvest, or procure wood products severely impaired? So when I asked for climate reasons, the average response was 19 weeks. A couple of people put 50 or 52 weeks, and those aren't not included in my totals here. And then I asked, how about market conditions? Because let's face it, market conditions have been not where we'd like them to be. And people said 13 weeks. Why this is interesting, you'd like all 13 weeks of market challenges to coincide with the climate, I guess, but chances are it meant more weeks than that. And why this is interesting to me is that I sort of have in my mind, after 25 years of asking loggers how many days or weeks they operate in a year, and asking equipment dealers how many weeks they think people need to be profitable, think about 40 weeks. There's only 52 weeks in a year. And if you're losing 19 to climate issues, how are you making a profit? That's a real problem. And, you're going to have years like that, but you can't have that year in and year out. All right. One of the other things I asked is, what are you doing in all this? Equal numbers told me they were downsizing as told me they were expanding. So maybe they're offsetting. Staying the course, to quote Forrest Tucker, they're going to endeavor to persevere, which is good. But 9% said they're going to find another way to make a living. So that means losses in our sector. 43% though said they're going to diversify products and services. I think in general, that's a good thing. But if you're a logger and you're going to diversify, that might mean less logging capacity. That's going to be a supply chain challenge. And we're going to see, that loss of capacity is a concern, certainly far and wide. I'm talking with people in the Lake States about this all the time. All right. Coming towards the end of what I have to tell you, and that will leave us, I think, time for questions. So to go back to this LSR project timeline, I'm still doing the needs assessment. I'm going to take the results of the survey, which please fill this out if you haven't done it already. To take that information into some more focus group conversations, and then come up with a plan to create and compile some resources. I'm supposed to come up with a mobile app to help with assistance, and probably some handoff type training packages and things of that nature. And the third year will be outreach and service provider training. And with that, I've told you about the climate adaptive cooperative agreement with the Forest Service in the past, and what's going on with this LSR at this point, and throwing a lot of details in that'll, I think, sound pretty familiar to some of you who are living these things. So we've got some time for questions. I'm going to leave my contact information up there for now. And Dave, you were supposed to have a long queue of questions for us at this point.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Steve and Dave, for these presentations and for sharing all this information. And just a reminder to folks, we do have a few minutes for questions. So if folks do have questions, please feel free to use the chat box. So you can type your question right in, or if you would prefer, happy to have folks ask questions live. So go ahead and just put your hand up, and we should be able to see you, and you can unmute yourself and ask a question live. So we'll give folks just a second to see if any questions come in. Again, thanks, Steve. While we're waiting for questions, you've piqued my curiosity. You ended the presentation talking about kind of loss of capacity. Any predictions or forecasting work that you've done, and thinking about kind of sort of how you mentioned the loss of work weeks, but is there somebody working on kind of forecasting and predicting kind of what this might mean for markets? And
well, I don't know what it'll mean for markets, but I'll give you a prediction. I gave the same prediction to some folks in Michigan. 10 years from now, all the loggers in Vermont will be good business people. What does that mean for the people who are not? Yeah, it's the challenge is that highly capital intensive, and yet a loss of that window to cover your fixed costs for the year and actually make a profit. So I think we're going to see that, we already have that trend across all industries, right, of an aging population who are getting ready to retire. I don't know if we have replacement level people coming in. And then if you look at, why do people invest in anything, right? To get a return. So if you're going to invest in logging equipment, highly depreciable, has to operate, and the risk has gone up, right? If the risk is you the kind of 200 days you planned on working aren't going to materialize. Well, when risk goes up, we look for more reward. The markets aren't offering more reward, so I think we're going to see some correction here. I know, and the loggers I'm talking with, they're looking for ways to have less capital investment in this, to find that sweet spot of used equipment that will work. But ultimately that means less capacity, right? Used equipment breaks down more. If you've got frontline equipment, and really brand new equipment is probably meant to work 2 shifts, which is not something we do in Vermont or in much of the region. The labor supply isn't there. So you got to get good used equipment. At what price? What's the right mix? And it's a moving target. It's tricky to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned, used equipment as sort of one technique. Mark asks, we do have a few questions that are coming in, and Mark asks in the chat, what other techniques are being used at other locations, around you mentioned Michigan, around the country, that maybe are maybe ahead of the curve in some respects, either in terms of, the changing climate, or just areas of the country that don't experience solid winters. Are there other techniques or, equipment? Types of equipment that we could be, looking to other areas of the country for as models, Steve, or
There are places we're doing things differently, and we don't have to look too far away, right? Southern New England, Southern New York, where they've lived this non-winter for a long time. That what we would think of as a traditional cold winter, they don't have. So, as one of the Catskill watershed people said to me, we have year-round mud season. It start stop. So to do that, you can do that if you're invested in a way that people were back in the early '80s or the '70s. Pickup truck, a cable skidder, maybe a loader, right? Hand felling. The reason they can do that in those regions is the timber quality is better. If you're going to cut half or more saw timber, you can do it that way. We have a lot of low grade wood that's got to be handled. That's why we've seen, the paradox of logging is the lower the unit value of the product, the more capital intensive the harvesting is. That's a reality. So we are starting to see in places people look at going back to company crews. So if you're a mill and you want to be open and you need to procure wood and there are not enough independent loggers, that's one approach to do that. And that means somebody else bears the risk of owning equipment. It's not widespread yet. And that remains to be seen if that's going to be a working solution.
Great. Another question that came up in the chat box around, you've talked a little bit about the significant impact of, or sort of economic impact, excuse me, of, the reduction in, ability to do forest harvest. Can you, and maybe Dave, you can chime in on this as well. Can you guys speak to the environmental impact on what less logging, means for health of our forests, for, for the environmental impacts of less logging?
Well, I'd say, less capacity means a whole lot of landowners who have things scheduled that might be, current use is at least flexible. Some of the programs in other states less so, but you've got things that you want to do to improve your forest, to address forest health, and you've got to find ways to do that. Things that used to be done commercially, right, where that would pay for themselves, I think you're going to have to hire a logger as a service provider to do them, and so that's going to be one change. Maybe Dave has something to add on this.
Well, I think the impacts can be, you know, pretty far reaching, honestly, if it's a loss of land accessible, or to the working forest, or the working landscape, and landowners are unable to grow high quality timber, or manage their land so that it's economically feasible to own land, then what are the alternatives for that forest and for that land base? And that's you know having it not be forest, because the value of land is much higher when it's sold to development, and we all know what that leads, the impacts of that. So I think we've all recognized the value of a working landscape, and a forest economy that's healthy is a benefit to the general, well, to everybody, and generally to forest landowners, so that they can continue to own their land. So it may not be, site specific as much as it is just in the general ability of landowners to maintain and afford their land, and keep it as forest, because the forest is pretty good at taking care of itself. If we do have stressors like um EAB, and invasive species, invasive plants, and risk losing natural regeneration to those things. But you know having a low grade market and ability to work in the forest, and generate an income, and as at the same time, um, make it a more diverse, more climate adaptive place, is, that's a long slide downhill. If that once one piece is missing in that, and that is the ability to get management done.
Great. Yeah, I think thinking back to Allie's webinar, right? And the 12 steps of climate resilience and the different strategies and techniques that we've been talking about in this series around keeping our forests resilient and able to adapt to climate change. I think as we think about the environmental implications of this, I think we need to keep that in mind, that forest management offers us in some respects an opportunity to help improve and keep our forests healthy in the face of climate change, right? So I think that the environmental impacts, in many respects, are still to be discovered or to figured out, right? We see the implications of a changing climate on the various stressors, like you mentioned, Dave, on our forests and invasives. Whether we're talking about invasive forest pests or plants or deer browse, all those other stressors, are just factors that I think complicate how we define a healthy forest and the management actions that are needed to keep our forest healthy, resilient, diverse, like you said. So yeah, it's a great question, and thank you to the folks in the
Very
chat
good
box
question.
for asking that question. Great. Well, we do have a note from Alice too around connecting with family in Finland, and I think in some respects in the past, we've looked to other countries, and Finland in particular, in terms of the way that they manage their forests and their equipment, and so I think potentially some lessons to be learned there. But Steve, I'll give you the last word on that. Again, sort of any other lessons to be learned from, we talked about in the United States, but abroad, any?
I wish I could tell you I had good lessons from abroad, but I don't think I do. But I think a lot of what we're going to have to do are things within our control, including being better project managers, taking advantage of the windows that are going to be open to us. And I'm going to go on for about an hour about that at the New England SAF meeting next month. And apart from that, I'll just say that I'm going to be on this project for 3 years, so some of you may be hearing from me, and hopefully I'll know a whole lot more a year or so from now and have more to share.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. We'll have to have you back. And there was a quick question from Bill in the chat about grants to in order to purchase equipment. Dave, I know that there are sometimes working lands grants available to logging companies and producers to support different aspects, of business planning. Steve or Dave, can you talk just a second about, business planning support and also any grants to help with, purchasing of new or different equipment?
Well, I can share with you that, working lands grants, at least the way they were worded this past year, and I expect into the future, are suitable for equipment, but you have to apply for them. So I was a reviewer on those, and I can tell you, loggers don't take the time to apply. And, you can't complain if you haven't asked, I guess. So, but I do know of several loggers that have had things funded that help them, uh, with their business, but even directly related to climate adaptation. And I think that is one of the scoring criteria in their evaluations.
Great. Well, thanks, Stephen. I'm happy as we follow up with folks from the webinar, we can provide links to more information on that. And so with that, I think we are at time. Thank you again, Steve and Dave, for taking time to join us and talking about this really important topic. And Steve, I expect we'll have you back, when your project's a little bit further along, and maybe we can dive into some of the strategies more next time we have you on. I do want to just remind folks, one, in the chat, I did actually put a link to the survey. Might have to scroll up a little bit to find it, but there is a link in the survey to Steve's survey or excuse me, a link in the chat box to Steve's survey. So if you haven't taken that survey, please take a minute to fill that out. Also in the chat box, if you are an SAF or Vermont licensed forester and looking for SAF continuing education credits, we have a link to our survey for today's webinar. And again, we just expect or hope that folks will take time to provide feedback and let us know how we did with the webinar today and give us some feedback for planning future programs. So please take a minute and go to that link again in the chat box to complete the survey for today's webinar. And we will be emailing that out as well to folks after today's session. So with that, and then finally, I guess the last reminder, I just wanted to put a final plug in. Dave mentioned in the beginning of the webinar about the upcoming Walk in the Woods this Saturday in Northfield. Again, I had put some information in the chat box earlier about that walk. But we'd love to have folks come out in the woods and have these conversations and look at a logging operation in real time and talk about some of these issues as well. So there'll be an opportunity to do that on Saturday. So please consider joining us then. That's it for today.
I just wanted to add, Kate, if anybody has questions about that, what to expect, what the conditions will be like, feel free to shoot me an email or call me. And it's actually in the town of Berlin, but it's very close to Northfield. So.
Oh, great. Okay, great.
It's right on Coxbrook Road. It's very, very beautiful setting, nice place, and would love to see people there.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Well, again, there's a link in the chat box to sign up and for information on that location. Just a final announcement that our next webinar in the Climate Smart Forestry series will be in the end of March, and we'll actually be joined by Savannah Farr, who is a forest health specialist with Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, talking about invasive forest pests. And we'll also have two walks actually as part of our next program in the Climate Smart series. We'll have a walk looking at hemlock woolly adelgid at the Jamaica State Park. And we will also have a walk looking at EAB at L.R. Jones State Forest in Plainfield. So we'll be sending out more information on those, but just a heads up that that will be the topic for March, and hope to have you back and join us for those webinars and walks in the woods. All right, that's it for today's program. Thanks everybody for joining us. And again, thanks to our presenters, Steve and Dave, for all the information you shared today.
Yeah. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks everybody. Have a great day. Hopefully you get out in the woods.
Thanks, Steve.
Thing.